The first thing that we want to do when teaching the A theme is trying to figure out what style we want to have. The editorial markings here would suggest that the A theme should be played in the lower half of the bow, because if we play everything as written here, that's where they're going to naturally end up. However, we got to think about the group that we have. Is everybody going to sound good if they play this at the frog? Do your violinists and violas have enough flexibility in their bow hand to be able to make this sound good? Or should we try it more towards the middle of the bow? And with the groups I've had and the groups that I've had play Kinetic, their level of technique is not quite there yet. It's something that we're working towards, but this is usually a contest piece for us, and we don't want to use this section as a proving ground to see if we've mastered that technique yet. We'd rather have them play in the middle of the bow where they're more comfortable and they can sound their best. When students are trying new techniques and they're trying to improve upon that kind of stuff, I tend to pick different literature, and I tend to program those more on my spring concerts or in other places where it doesn't affect any sort of contest rating. It's just something we can try and then perform and then evaluate. From a left-hand point of view, if we look at measure 9 and we look at the A theme, there are 4 patterns that we're going to need to learn. The first pattern, the first measure of 9, it comes back a lot. So it might not be something that you want to practice as much as the other ones, particularly pattern 4. In the teaching companion, I break down all of these patterns and then have them repeat measure by measure. In my teaching companions, I write it out for 4 measures, but that doesn't mean that you play this for 4 measures and then move on. No, it's you work on these 4 measures and then repeat back to the beginning, and you develop that speed. So start slowly, see if they can play it note by note, then increase the tempo a little bit, see if they can do it again, increase the tempo a little bit, see if they can do it again, and then push them up until they break, and then stop. Okay, there's only so much you can do in one day. So measure by measure, you go through the left-hand technique that's required. There's some right-hand technique too, but you can establish that pretty quickly. In the teaching companion, we establish it right here, where they're just working on playing in the middle of the bow, and they're matching bow length, and they're matching articulations on all of them so that we have a uniform sound. So that's the fastest way that I've found to teach the A theme to this, is to break it down by measure and really practice it slowly and incrementally ramp up the tempo. The teaching companion makes it easier to do this, and this is where I think the teaching companion actually has the advantage over doing it using rote technique, is because the violas are playing on the C string, and violas don't play on the C string a lot. But it might be good for them to actually read the notes and get comfortable with those C string notes rather than just memorize the fingers. The difficulties you're likely to run into with the B theme are mostly going to be rhythmic. There's some syncopation here, but it's not really the syncopation that gets you, it's the unequal bows. So we start with an 8th note, and that's going to be the shortest rhythmic value we have. And then we have quarter note. We have 2 8s tied together, which is another quarter note, so those are equal, but then the last 3 are tied together. So if the students aren't learning their bow distribution, then they might lag behind here in the end, or they might run out of bow and start rushing. There's a lot of problems that can occur because they don't understand the bow distribution. That's why I recommend that you do this just with the right hand only, so that the students can get real comfortable with the rhythm and how much bow to use before they start adding in the left hand. And before the students start adding the left hand, I have them practice the phrasing first before they even put down any fingers on the fingerboard. If you like to have your students think, and if you like to get them to think especially about music theory, a fun exercise in class might be to have your students look at these rhythms in the B theme. And there's 2 rhythmic variations, by the way. There's this one here in 33, and then it changes a little bit in 71. We don't have the groups of 3 on the last 3 8th notes. We have it in the middle. So it's 8th quarter, then the tie. That's your grouping of 3 here, and then the quarter note here. Now, this is written in a different way than it is up here. This breaks all of the 8th notes apart, and it's because the notes are moving, but here it's notated differently. It's 8th note quarter instead of 3 8th notes all tied together. So I would have your students look at this and ask them, how many different ways can you write it by creating ties instead of quarter notes, or creating quarter notes instead of ties? How many different variations can you write it? And then ask them, which one is the clearest to read as a performer? Which one can you clearly see the beats to help with your syncopation? And it'd be an interesting classroom discussion. People can say, well, I like this better because I like to be able to write 1 and 2 and have it line up with something instead of it just being a quarter note. And some people might say, well, I want less notes to look at and this saves space and so on and so forth. So it might be an interesting classroom discussion. It gets them to think about rhythm and think about notation. It looks at things from both sides of it, like, how do I read this and play it versus if I was going to write this, how could I make it clear for somebody else to play it? And those are two sides of the same coin. So here in the teaching companion, the rhythm number 1 I have labeled as the rhythm for the introduction to get students to be able to practice those bow lifts. Rhythm number 2 is what I call the initial B theme, and then that spot in 72 is going to be what I call rhythm number 3. And the teaching companion breaks this down for your students so they can practice it right hand alone and then learn to add in the phrasing. Again, you don't have to just do this once and then move on to the next one. In fact, that's not the best way to do it. You want to have them do it again and again and again, and then play around with the tempos so that they're learning the optimal technique and they're playing at the speed that they can play to play it accurately. Then you increase the tempo, that increases the stimulus for the student, and it's going to push them to be able to do things quicker. Once that breaks, though, you need to stop. Like, once their technique no longer holds up, you need to stop. They need to have time to recover so that learning can take place. It's a misconception that students learn while they're playing, or that they're learning material when they're studying and they read this thing and then all of a sudden they have it. That's not really what's going on. What's going on is the reading or the playing or whatever studying that occurs is creating a stimulus on your nervous system. And then the body releases these things called cytokines and interleukins, and it goes and tags things, and it says, hey, this needs to be repaired. We need a pathway here. We need to make stuff here. And then your immune system comes out and starts constructing things, constructing little highways for the neurons to go down to make things more efficient. That is when the learning occurs, not during the grinding of, oh, let's do it again, let's do it again, let's do it again. That's just the stimulus. The learning occurs probably while they're sleeping. And hopefully they're sleeping, and hopefully they're not staying up all night playing video games. All right, so in the next video, I'm going to talk about the common problems that I hear when I'm listening to orchestras play this piece, the common problems that I've run into every time I pull this piece out with one of my orchestras, and they tend to all be the same. The common problems tend to be fairly consistent. There's just some things that are tricky, and sometimes we overlook them because they don't come up a whole lot, or they're easy to sweep under the rug. So I hope to see you in the next video.